Welcome to Rome Baptist Church and a continuation on the Palm Sunday lectures. If you want to look at Matthew 21, starting with verse 1, Mark 11, starting with verse 1, Luke 19, starting with verse 28, and John 12, starting with verse 12, you can read about the triumphal entry. And this Sunday would mark an anniversary of this event. Jesus had purposefully put himself at a distance from Jerusalem for a good deal of time before the Passover. He indeed had set his face to go to Jerusalem for this Passover, but the timing of being in Jerusalem was important. The Gospels tell us that he was in Jerusalem during the day and going over the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus, to go back to Bethany to avoid being arrested. Was a part of his plan because the religious leaders were intent on capturing him and killing him, and indeed, he allowed that to happen. He knew that was the most important thing that he would do in his ministry. Yet in the meantime, there were some other very important things that he did, preparing his disciples, making himself known to the public, ministering to people out of compassion and by giving insight to these people as to who he was. So let's go back into history again and look at what this triumphal entry meant to the people of Israel, because there's a tremendous amount of history behind it. If we look at Leviticus 23:40, we read, "And you shall take with you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days." Now, these are instructions as to what they're supposed to do in worshiping God and celebrating what God had done in the past for them, trusting God to take care of them today, and trusting God to move forward in their lives in the future. And these instructions were specifically given to them for the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Palm branches were very important in the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. Sadly, some people have suggested that maybe the gospel writers were confused and that Jesus didn't enter into Jerusalem with this triumphal entry, this parade, this party during the time of Passover, but instead entered in on the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths instead, because of the emphasis on the palm branches. And they make the mistake of saying that the palms were very, very common in lower elevations, but they weren't common on the mounts where Jerusalem sits. And I think they're looking for some trivial issues to try and publish trivial books. The palm branches and the palm trees had become very important to Israel, and they had been very important to Israel for a long time, but particularly with celebrations, not just for the celebration of the Feast of Booths, but lots of celebrations were made important to them with the waving of palm branches. Why the palm? Both the willow and the palm branches were long. They're long. They're fairly strong. They have a very strong center stem, and then they have thin leaves growing off of them. As they spread out, they offer a fair amount, particularly the palm branches, offer a fair amount of shade. But what happens when you wave them, they sort of flutter. They look as if wind is blowing through, and it's rather graceful as opposed to taking another type of branch, a solid branch that would have bark on it, and waving that around with the leaves would certainly give a similar view, but not near the imagery that you have with a palm branch that is so graceful when you wave it. The willow branch is very much the same. There's this very graceful waving as if there's wind, and of course the Holy Spirit is likened unto wind. When Jesus talks to Nicodemus, he talks about the Holy Spirit as a wind coming through a force. And the same Greek word is used to describe both, pneuma. So we've got palm branches being used when Jesus walks in for the Passover. And there's a great history behind that. When we look at these palm branches being used in the celebration, we see them being used previously when the nation of Israel was faced with a very difficult situation about 200 years prior to Jesus walking in or riding in to Jerusalem at this very, very important Passover celebration. 200 years prior, Israel was under the control of a Greek nation whose headquarters were in Antioch. It was a very similar situation to what Israel found themselves during the time of Christ. Rome was in control with, of course, their headquarters here in Rome. This particular time, the Greek-controlled city of Antioch, the capital there, they controlled Israel from a much closer location. Now, you can look on the map and see that Antioch is basically directly north. And today you would find the ruins of this city in Turkey. So it was easier for them to dispatch soldiers to Jerusalem or to other parts of Israel if there was a problem. And there soon became a problem under Antiochus Epiphanes IV. They had a culture clash that ended up becoming a military clash. Antiochus Epiphanes IV not only wanted to control Israel politically, from a tax point of view and militarily, but he wanted Jews to become Greek in their thinking. He was going to make them function as Greeks function, think as Greeks think, and lose their Jewish identity and essentially lose their commitment to the one true and living God. And some Jewish priests realized that this was a very dangerous thing. And when they took over the temple and began bringing in items that would definitely be considered objects of worship, that was a problem. But even more so, they offered pig flesh on the altar, the sacred altar that was dedicated to serve God. And so these priests, particularly one family, they went by two names, the Hyrcanus family and the Maccabee family, rose up, gathered a large number of people, revolted against the Greek controllers, and eventually won a war. They fought against tremendous odds. They were always outnumbered, but they fought using guerrilla warfare tactics. And as a result, they came to a point where Israel had freedom. And we see the celebration of Hanukkah as a result of their victory over the Seleucids, who were headquartered at Antioch. And when they came into the temple, almost 3 years of occupation, you would call it, 3 years of the Greeks following through with pagan worship inside the temple. They had to clean up the temple, and in that process, there was only a small amount of oil, sacred oil, that could be used in the burning of the lamps. And it took a week for the oil to be purified in a ritual process. And they didn't have enough oil. They simply didn't have enough oil. And the tradition and the teaching is that miraculously, with far too little oil, they were still able to maintain the lamps. These very, very important lights within the temple were lit by oil that was set apart through ritual. And in spite of the fact of not having enough, they were able to keep those lamps lit for the week. And they see this as a miracle, and they see this as something worth celebrating every year. And so at our Christmas time, they celebrate Hanukkah. God having supplied this oil, very similar to Jesus providing food when there's not enough food. God provided oil when there wasn't enough oil. Hanukkah. It was 20 years before they were able to rid Jerusalem of Greek soldiers. Greek soldiers still remained in Jerusalem, in a center there, and they were eventually able to move them out in 141. So they had taken over the temple, and they were able to gain a very, very strong self-sufficiency, and they were able to worship the way that they wanted to and function pretty much the way they wanted to. But there was still this very difficult problem of soldiers being posted there in Jerusalem until they were able to rid them of that. And so there was a very important celebration that was to take place. And the celebration was a matter of Simon Maccabeus coming in to Jerusalem, surprise, surprise, in a procession, much like the procession that Solomon created when he came in to assure Israel that he was the one king. There were no other kings, just Solomon. He rode in on a mule, and the people celebrated to say, David's son Solomon is now going to lead us. He's the one in charge. This priest, Simon Maccabeus, made a similar entry, and the people waved palm branches. The palm branch had become the symbol of their unity, of their stability, of their freedom. And as this man came in to say, we now have self-rule, these Greek soldiers are no longer here in Jerusalem. There was a celebration. There was an entry procession, and palm branches were waved. And this is, as I said, about 200 years before Jesus makes his triumphal entry. We learn a lot about a culture from their coins. Coins, even though there's not much stamped on a coin, we can still learn quite a bit. Even today, when you look at a euro, there's usually on one side sort of a universal European image on the side of the coin. On the other side is normally something that represents the country where it was minted. And so you can see euro coins with a similar or the same stamp on one side because it's a euro, and then you turn it over and then you see where it was minted, because you'll see something that is very much about Italy, something that's about Greece, something that's about Germany or France or even the Vatican. We can learn a lot from coins. During this time of the Maccabean revolt, and after they won their victory and had completely eliminated this problem of Greek control, when they became their own country, their coins were minted with a picture of the palm branch on it. After Jesus made his triumphal entry, after he was crucified, after he rose from the dead, we find that Rome was still a problem for the nation of Israel. They looked to this time when the Jews rid themselves of the Greek controllers, and they wanted to rid themselves of the Roman controllers. So they printed coins, and on one side was stamped a picture of a palm branch. This attempt to free themselves from Rome was quelched. It was squelched by Titus, and you can see the celebration memorial of that in the arch to his triumph found in the Forum, fairly close to the Colosseum. So during this time, the coins are minted with one side being a palm branch. Both each time when Israel is striving for its independence from Greece and then twice from Rome, once in the late 60s with Titus ending that revolt in 70 AD, and then later when Hadrian is king, there's a revolt in the 130s, with the end of that revolt taking place in 135, when Hadrian's army marches in and destroys Jerusalem again. All three times you see coins minted with a picture of the palm branch. So the palm branch becomes very important to Israel. And it was important during the time of Jesus' entrance. I'm not saying this just to clarify that those who would say perhaps Jesus came in during the time of the Feast of Booths, but to just say how important the palm branch was. Palm branch was extremely important as a symbol for them. And I think also there's this image that is projected when a palm branch is waved, as well as other branches, but the palm branch adds just a certain extra to it all, to say that it's like wind blowing and the power of the Spirit. And the hope is found in this symbol. It's a symbol of national independence. It represented what Israel wanted from Jesus. They wanted a king to come in and establish national independence. And so we also see in the palm branch being waved the same message that's being said, as they're quoting Psalm 118, verse 25. O Lord, do save, we ask you. Lord, save us, we ask you for prosperity. So as these two groups are coming together, one group following Jesus down the hillside from the Mount of Olives, working his way down into the Kidron Valley and back up. Another group comes out of Jerusalem and meets with them, this joyous celebration, waving palm branches, saying, we are expecting you. We're expecting you to save us from Rome. Give us prosperity and our desire to be one nation without Roman control. The Psalm 118 was a fairly common psalm, known as one of the Psalms of Ascent. And you read, and they say that Psalms of Ascent begin with Psalm 120. All of the Psalms between 120 and 134 are considered to be ascension Psalms, but most also would agree that Psalm 118 is also a Psalm of Ascent. We think that Psalm 118 may have been written during the joyous celebration under Nehemiah of the completion of the walls. This took place about 444 BC. You can read about it in Nehemiah 12:27. And as the nation of Israel is essentially cleaning up and trying to get back to where they originally were as a nation, having walls to protect them around the city, having homes to live in that are constructed, having a temple where they can worship. More than likely, we don't know for certain, more than likely Psalm 118 was a psalm written for this setting as they celebrated the completion of the walls under Nehemiah's leadership. Martin Luther said it's his very favorite psalm. So as the people there's also a discussion as to when these ascension psalms were sung. Some would say that they were sung as the people walked the 25 kilometers from Jericho to Jerusalem. My guess is that's probably true, and that people like to sing songs of celebration, especially at a time of celebration, as people are traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem. And a large number of people would have done this every year, some of them 3 times a year, coming to Jerusalem for the 3 major festivals. They would have been singing these songs. It's a long, long walk. Some would say that these psalms were sung as the priests ascended the 15 steps from the area of the temple dedicated to Jewish women into the area of the temple dedicated for the priest to work and to serve. Singing, O Lord, do save, we beseech you. O Lord, we beseech you, do send prosperity. we like music at Rome Baptist Church. I love music. And some of the music I enjoy the most are Christmas carols. We've sometimes been a little disappointed when the weather is bad on Christmas Eve when we go out to sing our Christmas carols outside of the church in the piazza. Sometimes the piazza is just absolutely, it's sort of like it is today. Not many people are out there. Maybe one or two people are at VD's having coffee, all bundled up because the weather is so cold. In 2019, however, last Christmas Eve, the weather was almost as nice as it is now. People were bundled up a little, but it was not inclement. It was a nice evening. And we had a large group, probably the largest group we've ever had for Christmas Eve. So we went out with our candles lit, stood in a circle, and sang Christmas carols. Most everybody knew at least the first verse of most of them. It was interesting with the number of people who were walking around in the piazza, the number of people who were sitting at VD's. Many came and joined our circle. Some of them were dressed, and I'm assuming because of their dress, they were Muslims. But because we were standing around singing with candles, they didn't join in the middle of the circle, but they came and stood around the peripheral. Some who were dining at VD's or having coffee at VD's came and joined into our circle. We sang so long, the candles were getting shorter. The children were getting their fingers burned and handing the candles off to mom and dad. And we were leaving a lot of wax on the pavers down there, which I love it. Every time I walk in, I see those pavers, and I remember we sang Christmas carols. Not only were we having a great celebration together, remembering Christmas, remembering God becoming one of us, God coming to earth as one of us to communicate to us. He loved us so much. But we also were able to take this message in song to other people, and they were touched. We had at least a dozen people who were not in our service who came to join in around in the circle. And as I said, some of them obviously were not Christians. They were dressed as Muslims, and they were welcome. They were more than welcome. Who more do I want to carry the message to than Muslims who are visiting Rome? So we see that a lot of things are taking place. There's a message being said in the mode of transportation Jesus has used. A donkey, a young donkey. He's coming in peace, not in war. He's coming because the peace has already been won. He's coming in victory, as it was for Solomon, who indeed was king as he rode in on the mule. He was coming in victory. As Simon Maccabeus was coming in, the victory was won. All the soldiers were gone. It was a long process. But now they were celebrating the victory of independence. It was done. Jesus was entering. The victory was won. And people were singing the songs of the season, singing the songs that many of them had memorized from the time they were children. So you can just hear them singing loudly with joy, without the concentration of, I don't know this song and what are the words. They would have known the words. Singing this song as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, making his statement, I am here. And in the future, when you look at Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 through 10, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne, before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." So, palm branches were important all of Israel's history. When the spies went in to scope out the land, they found the land, the promised land, to be fruitful. It looked as if it would be very, very easy for them to thrive in the promised land. 12 spies were sent from Kadesh Barnea into the land, and the rest of Israel waiting for their message. They'd been through a number of very difficult tests coming across the Sinai Peninsula. They'd seen God free them from Egypt through great miracles. They'd crossed the Red Sea, and yet they still struggled when it came to their faith. And there were 7 crops that were very, very important. And these crops were going to stand out as promises of what they would expect to be able to enjoy. And one of those crops was indeed the date. We'll look at those crops again later. One of them was the date that came from the palm tree. Exploration throughout the Middle East, exploration throughout Northern Africa, and just the ability to travel and to caravan, carrying goods back and forth across those regions, was made possible through fruits like dates, because they could carry them and they wouldn't spoil. Without, it is said by one historian, without the palm date, this exploration of the area and these caravans traveling back and forth would have been extremely difficult had it not been for palm dates, because they last so long and they're able to find them along the way. Palm branches. It meant so much. It meant so much to the nation of Israel that they used the palm branch on their coins as they're proclaiming, we are God's children. We have this land. We are His. And no one rules over us but God. This is what they were waving. Not just a branch that carried with it some imagery that I think is important, as the kind of silky movement of these leaves and the branches would indicate the power of the wind. But also they represented their independence, their nation, and God's supply, and God's enticing them into a better life with this fruit is available. Come, enter into the new life. All of this was a part of what they were experiencing, and with that, they're bringing with them some sadly false ideas, thinking that Jesus was to be the Messiah who would today ride in on a donkey in peace, but would later ride in as one who had conquered Rome and moved Roman troops out. They had the precedence with the Greeks being conquered. Now they're looking for Jesus to do that with the Romans. This is a sidelight. It's not really a part of the triumphal entry, but I think it's interesting. From the point of leadership, this capital that the Greeks had built, came a very important movement within the church. In Antioch, and there are several Antiochs because of Antiochus. And the name Antiochus was used for several kings. We note that this Antiochus that the Jewish nation had to deal with was Antiochus IV. Being the name of many kings that were in control of the region, there's more than one Antioch. But this Antioch that was the capital for these kings, these Greek kings, later under Roman rule, Antioch became an important city for the Roman government, but it also became a very important city for the church. A church in Antioch was found to be populated. The congregation was made up of not just Jewish people, but a large percentage of Gentiles, which was unusual in the early church. When things exploded in Jerusalem and 5,000 people are in attendance in churches within Jerusalem, the vast majority of them were Jewish, as was true for other churches outside of Jerusalem. But in Antioch, we find a large percentage of the members there being Gentile. Barnabas moved there to work with the church, to help the church understand what it meant to be a Christian. Paul met with his good friend Barnabas, and they began working together. They served the church, and then the church leaders came together and prayed and decided that Paul and Barnabas should go and establish churches. Today we would call plant churches. And years gone by, we would say set them apart as missionaries to establish churches around the Mediterranean. So this city that was established by Greek conquerors who eventually lost their control of Jerusalem and Israel and were later conquered by Rome, this city was established for one kind of conquering. It became a city, a headquarters for another kind of conquering. I don't know how often Paul, Barnabas, or John Mark rode on a donkey, if they used donkeys when Silas took off on the second missionary journey with Paul. But we do know that as Jesus walked in, saying that a victory has already been won, and I'm here as your king, trust me. And although they didn't really understand what he was leading them to, he was leading them to a much greater freedom than they were to experience if they had been able to free themselves from Roman control. The freedom that he offered was the freedom of the soul, a freedom that comes with knowing truth, knowing his truth, and allowing that truth to free us on the inside. So as the Greeks established their controlling capital and Rome took over that capital of control and used it for a sub-capital for control, the church also established itself, and it became the sending agent for missionaries who, although they probably didn't spend a lot of time on donkeys, came in the name of the king. They weren't the king, but they came in the name of the king, bringing peace, the same peace that Jesus was bringing to Jerusalem. Although those who were celebrating didn't really understand it. As John said, we didn't understand what was going on until he rose from the grave. And then suddenly it made sense. The lights were turned on. Illumination took place. God's words made sense to them. God's actions made sense to them. And they found the greatest freedom of all. I'm excited that we can meet when there's no coronavirus. I'm excited that we can meet together in freedom here in Italy. It hasn't always been the case. I'm excited that I've lived in a country where you can meet and talk about Jesus, sing about Jesus, read about Jesus, and commune with other fellow worshipers. And you don't have to worry about authorities coming in with weapons to tell you to go home. And that's a great freedom. I wish the whole world had this freedom. Many do not, sad but true. But the freedom that Jesus came to offer in his triumphal entry was a freedom far greater than even this political freedom that we enjoy. I willfully will give them the right to tell us not to meet because of our own safety issues. I expect to be able to meet in freedom soon. Sadly, not before Easter. But at the same time, we have the freedom that Jesus came to give Israel and to give to us. This freedom that has been proclaimed thanks to people like Paul and Barnabas, John Mark, Silas. This freedom that has been preached for almost 2,000 years now. It brings us a freedom of the soul. Jesus marched in triumphant, saying, we no longer are living in captivity. He came in peace in that in his proclamation, the freedom was already gained, just as it had been with Solomon saying, we have a king, we have a leader, And he comes to say there will not be any more strife. Just as Simon Maccabeus wrote in to say, we're no longer under foreign control, but we are under God's control. We've been celebrating in our temple for almost 20 years now, but we can now celebrate. They're no longer guards. They're no longer those who watch over us. We have our own sovereign king. And this, of course, is what Jerusalem wanted when Jesus came in. But the greatest freedom that will be experienced is the one described in Revelation. Amongst more people than we can count, the promise given to Abraham, all children of Abraham, at the feet of the Lamb on the throne, the Lamb, the one who gave himself for us, we will find the freedom of the soul, the freedom that Jesus gives to us in salvation.